Introducing you to people across North Carolina and around the world who put their Catholic faith into action. This is FaithWorks on Catholic 540 AM Divine Mercy Radio. Now, here's your host for FaithWorks, Ellen White.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. Our show highlights individuals through God's grace who put their faith into action daily. Amazing people who have an interesting, sometimes overlooked impact on our Catholic faith. On FaithWorks, we share their stories. I'm your host, Ellen White. Welcome again to Saints in the Making, where we explore the lives of saints whose witness still speaks powerfully today. This month, we're focusing on Saint Athanasius, Saint Rita of Cascia, and Saint Mary Magdalen de Pazzi. Three remarkable lives that guide us toward truth, perseverance through suffering, and a deeper life of prayer for the renewal of the Church. We're once again joined by Rob Agnelli, Catholic speaker, theologian, and longtime student of the saints, who will guide us through their lives and help us see how their witness speaks into our own call to holiness today. Welcome back, Rob.
Good to be back.
Wow, you know what? I'm so inspired and encouraged by our discussions before the interview. So maybe at some point we should record those too and share. But all right, so let's start with Saint Athanasius. Feast day is May 2nd. He was born in 296 and died around 373. I think that's about right. He grew up in Alexandria and became a key defender of Christ's divinity during the Arian crisis, even facing exile multiple times. What can you tell us about his early life?
So he was from Alexandria, Egypt. Don't know a whole lot about his parents. We sort of find a story of the bishop named Alexander of Alexandria at the time, looking out his window and seeing some boys out there playing church. And he sees this one boy who's kind of the leader of the boys, and they are actually practicing baptizing. And so he's using water in the baptismal formula. And so the bishop calls the boys over and asks the leader of the boys, who turns out to be Athanasius, if he realized that he actually had baptized someone. And so what he does, rather than chastising him, he sort of takes him as his sort of adopted son. The boy Athanasius had told him that he wanted to be a priest, and then he was, willing to do all the work necessary, and he was kind of practicing. And so Alexander kind of invests in him, and continues to form him in the faith. He grows up sort of in the shadow. The timing is sort of the last, sort of set of Christian persecutions, and Constantine, right? And so, although the persecutions don't necessarily stop, especially Athanasius finds out, but so the bishop before Alexander had been martyred, and so Athanasius was well aware of and inspired by those martyrs that had come before him, and so it's really his formation, and the fact that he is surrounded by these great witnesses that sort of turn him into the man that he is.
Well, I mean, especially with Bishop Alexander bringing him in. I just want to say, too, what a beautiful sight to see out your own window, these three kids playing church.
Yeah.
But to call him in and to be, kind of a mentor to him. So he, at a young age, was intimately familiar with what was going on in the church. So how powerful is that? Well, obviously, he had faced or had seen a lot of persecution in the church, but what gave him the courage to remain steadfast in the midst of all this? And as he got older...
I think some of it is just so that formation is really important because it gives him confidence, right? So what happens is Alexander has him initially as his secretary, and then he's ordained a deacon, and then Alexander brings him to the Council of Nicaea.
Wait, how old is he at this point? What are the ages?
Yeah, so I think he is probably in his early 20s by the time. So he's 13 or 14 probably when Alexander meets him. And actually he spends which is just really crazy. Alexander sends him off to the desert to live with St. Anthony and the monks for a little while. And so he acts as an acolyte for St. Anthony. Then ends up at the Council of Nicaea in 325, just as a deacon. So he's just assisting Alexander. And the Bishop Alexander actually, after the Arians sort of make their argument, he turns to Athanasius, who is this 21, 22-year-old man, and basically has him respond to the Arians. Oh, wow. So Athanasius stands up and just says, who has deceived you, calling the creator a creature, and just quickly puts an end to all the debate. And so also just gifted with that sort of that presence, right, of just being able to cut through with the truth.
A gifted orator.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm just curious about his education and his training besides being with Bishop Alexander. Do you know much about his education?
Yeah, I mean, he was educated by the bishop, and other than that time he spent in the desert with the monks, really learning how to pray, which is key to it, is really where his formation comes from.
Well, and I think being in the desert with the monks prepared him for his time of exile too. I mean, God uses, you say this so many times, Rob, God uses everything.
Wastes nothing. But it's also, I mean, and that's the other piece, right? So, Alexandria at the time is like the sort of the center of learning, right? So you have the great library there, and so, now Egypt is not as Christian as it obviously was then, or nowhere near really, but it was just the center of learning, right? And so, not surprisingly, how grace perfects nature. God gave this really intelligent young man a good education, and then informed in the faith, and he becomes probably one of the greatest saints in the church.
Wow. Okay, so let's get back to this question about being exiled for defending the truth. How can suffering and rejection strengthen rather than weaken our commitment to truth?
Yeah, I think this is where if you, it's funny because one of the sort of complaints that the Arians used against Athanasius was that he was obstinate. And so,
well, for those that don't know what obstinate means,
obstinate, he's just, very, in a certain sense, argumentative and unwilling to move. And I think, very often that there can be a holy obstinance that we all need to develop. And I think this is really captured. St. Jerome had a saying about Athanasius where he said it was Athanasius against the world. And so what Athanasius, his disposition really was that he knew as long as he had Christ on his side, even if he was alone, that the world stood no chance. And so that very often, that's what happens, right? Because in suffering, especially suffering for Christ, you're drawn closer to him. Mm-hmm. And then you suddenly realize like how powerful you are because it really is you and Jesus against the world, and the world doesn't have a chance, right?
Athanasius against the world. I love that. St. Jerome. Okay, Arianism was widely accepted, and this time you've talked about this briefly before. What does his life teach us about standing firm when error becomes popular?
Yeah, so
again, with being strong.
Arianism, for those who don't know what it is, essentially is the belief, in broad strokes, that Jesus was not divine, and so that he was a creature, God's highest creature, but nevertheless still a creature. I think essentially you think about like that he had all the divine attributes except divinity itself, right? And so, it seems like a subtle sort of, a nuanced position, but you don't realize like how important it ends up becoming. And so I think we have to sort of understand, because of the culture we live in now, just what a big deal heresies are. Right, like the social effects of heresies. And for Arianism at the time, it's really the first really threat that the church faces, because what had happened is it really became a social movement. And so the army, which at the time is sort of the leading part of the culture, right? Like, so these are where all the intelligentsia are in the army, and they're all Arian. And so they look down on the Christians that are Orthodox and think, oh, you stupid Christians, right? And so it hangs on for a really long time because it seems to be like the sort of cool way to look at Catholicism. And then, of course, it makes it a little more palatable for the pagans because there's this sort of, man who becomes God, and which is, fits into a lot of the pagan stories. And so there was a lot of just power behind Arianism, and that causes a lot of the issues.
But yet okay. So I was going to say, with the heresies, just a little side comment, and this keeps coming up over and over and over again, everything repeats itself, and there are no new heresies. So if someone was interested in familiarizing themselves with what the heresies are in the church, what would you recommend that we do so that we can familiarize ourselves, so that we are able to stand firm and say, no, that's part of this?
Yeah, I mean, there's several really good books on just the different heresies, although none are coming to mind at the moment.
Sorry, I threw that on you. It wasn't part of this.
But I mean, John Henry Newman has a really good book. I think it's called The Arians of the Fourth Century.
Okay.
And which was almost like him writing that book was instrumental in his own conversion, because what he did was, and this is the part about it repeating itself, was he saw how Arianism was sort of linked to the state, was linked to Constantine and his sons, and how it became like really a question of power.
Oh, okay.
And then he took that and mapped that onto what happened in England.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he realized, oh, I'm no different than the Arians, right? And that actually sort of changed his mind. So he has a really good book on the Arian heresy, but he talks about heresies in general.
Okay.
Which is well worth sort of understanding. What I think is really important to understand for us, especially in America, right, is we think it's just a verbal sort of squabble, right? Like does it really matter whether, Jesus became God or was God or is God? It just seems like a semantic sort of theological discussion, and does it really matter? And then you realize what the effects of, I think it was Leo XIII said that, at the heart of every social ill is a heresy, right? And you can see it's sort of going on in our culture now.
Yes.
Right. There's some heresies sort of spreading around that are causing havoc.
You know what helps me, honestly, Rob, is when I am very simple-minded, and I like to keep things simple, and I just always come back to the Eucharist. And yeah, it does matter because Christ is present in the Eucharist, and without the Eucharist, to hell with it.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I mean, really, like literally.
Yeah. So I think that's something to keep in mind too. But if you want to become familiar with the different heresies and recognize that they keep repeating themselves, I highly recommend that you check that book out. And
it's always a good idea, honestly, to, I would say if you want to learn about the heresies, it's always a good idea to first really study the creed.
Oh, right. Good point. Yeah.
Because again, you can see how you can easily get caught, because it's way harder to defend a position than to criticize it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great point. Yes.
And so until you understand the nuances of it, very often, the heresies will seem reasonable.
You need to say that again. What was that? It's way harder to...
It's way harder to defend a position than to pick it apart.
Yeah. Yes, that's definitely worthy of a note and meditation. Okay, so did you answer the question? What does his life teach us about standing firm when error becomes popular?
I don't think so.
We just talked about heresies.
No, I mean, so in the end, what it really teaches us is that, so if you... I mean, I guess now going back to the question you actually asked rather than what I answered. So what happened to him, right, was so he was exiled 5 times. And so he ends up pretty much being sent all over the place. And what he does is he doesn't just sit still. So I think it's the second time he's exiled. He takes monasticism to the West. So he takes everything St. Anthony taught him and brings it to the West. And then, St. Benedict later picks it up, right? And then, I think it's the third time he's forced to go to Rome. And when he goes to Rome, he then teaches everyone in the West about the incarnation. And so he just, every single time, and this is why, Jerome says it's like Athanasius against the world, because he just keeps going, right? He's like, okay, where's Christ having me go now? Okay, I'll go there. I'm going to still same message. And it's back to the, God wastes nothing.
Well, and also, too, I did an interview last month with an author, Patty Armstrong, and she was talking about a recent servant of God, Michelle Dupont, and she said the same thing. She was struck a blow with something that she really felt like the Lord was calling her to, but instead of, woe is me, why wasn't I chosen for this? I'm going to be depressed for the next several months or whatever, and just wallow in this pity. Okay, the Lord has something else planned for me, so I'm going to, head for, and we have a priest that passed away several years ago that did the same thing. He loved being a pastor and was called to a different position. And he said, this is where the Lord is having me go. So I accept that and I move on. We're so much more effective that way.
Yeah. Well, because it's, if you do God's will and throw yourself into it, you're always happier and better off anyway.
Yes. Thank you. All right. So he wrote clearly, St. Athanasius, and boldly to defend the faith. Why is clarity in teaching so important, Rob, especially in times of confusion?
Yeah. So Arius himself was like a rock star at the time and had a tremendous amount of gifts, very well spoken. Everyone liked him. But he also learned how to play a card that a lot of people play now, is like the dissenter as victim. And so he had sort of set himself up as a victim, and he would use that against Athanasius. He would constantly send people to, one point he sends, a bishop friend of his to Constantine to say, well, I don't understand why, Athanasius is treating him this way. But the point of the clarity in teaching, one, is the fact that really the heresies are good for the church, right? In the sense that they always provide clarity, right? So, Arius didn't really know it, but he was being used as an instrument for us to really understand the incarnation, right? To really wrestle with it, right? Mm-hmm. And what it does is it shows us that the faith is always living and active, but it also validates the need for the church. And so how does a Protestant respond to the Arian heresy? Like who's going to squash the Arian heresy? They can't, right? They can disagree about it. Well, Arius could just say, well, the Holy Spirit told me this, right? But it shows why God, in his wisdom, gave us an authoritative church, because when he gives us revelation, if he doesn't give us a way to protect it, and that's why clarity is important, because, and the practical part of it is, it just gives us more reasons to love the wisdom of God, right?
Gosh, and the depth of it. There's always so much to learn. Okay, a quote of St. Athanasius is, God became man so that man might become God. I love that. And a personal challenge for those of us that want to reflect deeply on St. Athanasius is, where is God calling us to stand firm in truth, even when it's difficult or unpopular? We don't have to go far for that these days. All right, St. Rita of Cascia, feast day is May 22nd. She was born in 1381 and died in 1457, so a little closer to us. She was born into a humble family, and I've used her a lot, her intercession a lot. Entered a difficult marriage and later became a widow and a religious after deep personal loss. Expound on that a little bit. Where
she is. It's funny, we were talking before we came on air about miracle children, right? She's one of those miracle children. Her parents were very pious, known for their great sanctity, but didn't have any children. And then her mother at a very late age was visited by an angel, telling her that she was going to have this child of great sanctity, who was gifted of every virtue, a helper of the helpless, and a guiding star for the church. And so, her parents are older when she's born in 1381. And of course that, God had obviously a plan for her, and she, she's born and she enters this pious family, and she sort of picks up the piety and runs with it. She builds an oratory in her home, and decides she's going to live a cloistered life in her home. So she stays that way for a year, and then a lot of her story is really in a story of suffering that comes about because of obedience. And so her, she really wants to enter religious life. She, pledges herself to Jesus when she's 12, but her parents don't want that. And so she kind of, which in a lot of ways makes sense. She's an only child. Someone has to take care of her parents. And so she's heartbroken. When she finds out that her parents wanted to marry, but she also clearly understood what God's will was for her. So she embraced what her father wanted, and enters into the married life.
And what happened as a result of that?
Yeah. So her husband, that they chose for her, was well off, but not a good man. His name was Paolo Mancini. He was pretty much, by no means was he religious. And it didn't really take him very long to treat her pretty poorly. Treating her with contempt, flying into rage, pretty much everything she did. And it's very interesting how it's a very sort of Saint Monica feel to it, how she responds to him. She doesn't just cower into the corner, but she also doesn't fight back. And so she sort of, she conquers him with charity, but with wisdom. And so, the sort of the more harsh he is, the more kind and humble and obedient she becomes to him. And that at first has this opposite effect where he just becomes harsher and harsher. But over time, it starts to sort of to change him, right? And so she's sort of governed by prudence. At times, she'll remain silent, and other times she'll encourage him to goodness. And eventually, she sort of awakens his conscience, and he becomes a changed man.
Okay, so I'm curious about her faith life. Obviously, that's what she was leaning on in the midst of these tremendous struggles. What did it look like? What did you find in your research?
Yeah, I mean, at this point in her life, there's not a lot about, her interior life. And I don't know that we know a whole lot about her interior life. Obviously, a woman of prayer, and just, the refusal to see herself as a victim, going back to what we talked about, and only seeing herself in the eyes of the true victim, which is Christ, right? And so you have a choice, right? You can either see yourself as a victim or see the one who really is a victim at Christ and draw your power from him. And that's what she does, right? And so, she leads her husband through conversion. And he eventually, confesses his sin, receives her with deep gratitude. And, this conversion just goes deeper and deeper. And their home becomes this like paradise of mutual love and holiness.
Wow. Well, I'm curious what this example of hers teaches us about the power and difficulty of true forgiveness. Rob? Yeah,
this is, again, like the idea of sitting with in the midst of, because partially what happens with her is her husband, after he goes through all of this, right? Her husband is eventually killed by his enemies that she encouraged him to forgive. And so she is confronted immediately with the difficulty of forgiving them. And at this point, she also has two sons, and this is very much a vendetta culture. And so she has spent a lot of time with her sons, bringing them up in the faith, teaching them to be pious. But she learns that they're planning a vendetta to kill the men that killed her father, right? And so, she initially is worried, first of all, for her husband's salvation, and God gives her a grace to understand that although he didn't receive the sacraments of the dying, that he was okay. And then she immediately forgives them, right? And so then she now works on her sons, trying to get them to forgive him as well. And they're pretty resistant to it. And she makes a really, really hard prayer that essentially asking God that if it's the choice between them living and or them killing their supposed enemies, that, God would take them. And so within a year, both of her sons die. And so God mercifully steps in before they do anything, and brings them back to himself. And so now Rita is not only a widow, but now lost both of her sons. And so she's totally sort of bereft in the world, and has no one. Her parents had died earlier. And so now she sort of begins to look at religious life again.
It opens it up for her. And that's the one thing that I remember about St. Rita of Cascia, is this loss of her sons, and her fervent prayer for them and their souls. It's something you just don't forget. All right, if you're just tuning in, this is Ellen White with FaithWorks on Divine Mercy Radio. And today I'm joined by Rob Agnelli as we reflect on the saints we honor this month: St. Athanasius, St. Rita of Cascia, and St. Mary Magdalen de Pazzi. We're exploring their lives, their virtues, and the lasting impact they continue to have on the life of the church. And we're grateful for our show sponsor, Thales College, for supporting FaithWorks and helping us share these stories of faith in action. Wow. Okay, so St. Rita of Cascia. She's also known as the Saint of Impossible Causes, which is a prayer that you can look up and pray. What does her life reveal about trusting God when situations seem hopeless?
Yeah, so she's obviously confronted with crushing disappointment at every turn, right? So even after she turns to religious life again after her husband dies, she's turned down. And she really can't understand why. She's offering herself to Jesus, and it seems like she's not wanted, right? And it turns out that the sisters in the convent that she was trying to get into were relatives of the men who had killed her husband. And so they were afraid to have her come in. And so eventually, God sort of steps in and sends her St. John the Baptist and St. Augustine, who carry her into the convent. And so the sisters wake up one morning and she's there. And they're like, well, this must be God's will, because it's a cloistered convent. How did she get in?
Oh, my goodness.
And so after she explains how she got there, they accepted her. But the point is that really, after being denied all of those things, religious life, first from her father, abusive marriage, man finally converts, then the man dies, sons die. What really is striking about her is her willingness to give God permission to disappoint her, which very often is a real obstacle for us, because what happens too often is we're afraid to ask God for something, because that when you ask for something, you also open yourself up to be disappointed. And she was not afraid to be disappointed by God, because ultimately she knew that his plan was best, and that whatever he had in mind, as bitter as it might seem initially, was better for her. And so, from that sort of perspective, very often what seems hopeless to us is really just our fear of being disappointed by God.
Yeah, vulnerability.
Yeah, 100%.
It's huge.
100%.
And her holiness was lived quietly through, obviously, lots of suffering and sacrifice. What does that say about unseen acts of love?
Yeah, so one time St. Rita was praying, and she asked for the grace to have a single thorn from the crown of thorns, and our Lord delivered it to her and put this sort of wound right in the middle of her forehead, which is like a pretty obvious one, right? But the pain of it would sort of increase day by day by day, and the wound itself had worms in it, and it smelled, and it became just revolting. And so she becomes this sort of object of nausea among all the sisters. And so this is all while she's hidden, right? And she's asked for this, and now she becomes this object of revulsion. And so she wants to go to Rome for the Jubilee of 1450. And she asks the prioress if she can go. And the prioress is like, no, we're not letting you out of here looking like that, right? And so she asks Jesus, she goes back to Jesus and then expresses her disappointment that she can't go to the Jubilee, doesn't ask for anything, just expresses her disappointment. And she said, I asked for this, I asked for this wound, thank you. And she thanks him in gratitude. And the wound is miraculously healed. And so she goes to the Jubilee. And then the minute she walks back in the door, the wound is back.
Oh my God.
And so the point of this, right, is she just wanted to love Jesus. Right. And if that meant, missing out on things, that was okay. But she just wanted to love him. And, no one knew, the source of this disgusting wound, and she was content with it. And she was actually grateful for it, right? Something she really wanted. She didn't ask for it. She just expressed disappointment that she couldn't have both. And she just wanted what Jesus wanted.
So to answer the question, the value of unseen acts of love, growing in our relationship with the Lord at such an intense level that nothing else.
Well, but the other piece of it too, which is maybe the obvious part, is there are no unseen acts of love, right? They're like Christ sees all. And we're talking about this, 500 years, 500 years later, right? Almost 600 years later, right?
Well, it's interesting that I was looking at it from the perspective of others as opposed to God and what he sees all. It doesn't matter whether or not people experience it. All right. A quote of hers is, "Love God and do not sin. Do not offend him." Personal challenge with St. Rita is there someone we need to forgive or a situation we need to entrust more fully to God? Right now I can think of several. Okay, so last saint, St. Mary Magdalen de Pazzi, feast day May 25th, and just a couple hundred years after, maybe 150 after St. Rita. She was born in 1566 and died in 1607. Tell us about her early life and what she was like.
So born in Florence, and as you said, 1566. She was the second child, only girl. Parents had a great devotion to Saint Catherine of Siena, which she also had, being from Florence. Her baptismal name was Catherine. So when she's 14, her father is appointed governor of a nearby town, Cortona, which means they're leaving Florence. But he lets her stay behind at this convent where one of her aunts was a nun. And when she's there is when she has this sort of profound conversion experience and a recognition of her vocation, that she has this call to the Carmelites. Her father returns back home, and then shortly after she enters Carmel and takes the name Sister Mary Magdalene.
Okay, so she had some encounters with God. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so she had these sort of mystical experiences pretty regularly up to a certain point.
Was it when she was in the convent?
Yeah, it was. Okay. It was when she was in the convent, and they were kind of off and on. So she would have these really deep, profound mystical experiences. In fact, she would be uttering things, and they had secretaries who would write down what she was saying. I think there's 4 books of her sayings, and I think so. It was regular, but then she would also go through some periods of really dry aridity. In fact, she had this sort of extended ecstasy just for Jesus to tell her that he wanted her to suffer this long period of aridity at the end of her life. But I think so. Very often, right, we can look at the saints and think, okay, they have these mystical experiences. Like, I don't have mystical experiences. Like, what does this sort of tell us, right? And I think what really helps us to grasp is the principles of the spiritual life, which are for the life of Christ to be reproduced within us, and that's what happens, right? So she has these mystical experiences, and she really. They're mostly about the life of Christ.
Explain that. What do you mean by?
Yeah, so she will have visions of the Passion or visions of the life of Christ. Or
and another reason why it's so good to pray the Rosary, because you're constantly reflecting.
Exactly. And so, she has these mystical experiences, but the prayer is the same prayer we're all called to, which is to meditate on the life of Christ and to become other Christs, right?
Okay, so what can this teach us about seeking God wholeheartedly, even at a young age?
I think from that perspective, you can't forget that, like, that prayer is a gift to you, right? And what it's meant to do to us is not just, it's for us to know God better, but to love Him more, right? And so it really is understanding that charity is a thing that's infused in us and is a gift from God. And the ordinary means in which we do that is through our spiritual life.
And that's why we're here, right? To know, love, and serve God. She was living during a time, and it seems to be a redundant theme with some of these saints, that there was this desire for renewal in the church. Tell us what she encountered and what she did, and also how we can contribute to the church's renewal in our own time, Rob.
Yeah. So the renewal of the church, right? So she's living again, like, sort of at the back end, like the contemporaries are Saint Teresa Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and so she's living, in a renewal that really is starting with an interior renewal. Like, we forget that sometimes, right? We forget that what people call the Counter-Reformation also starts with, if you start to think about all the saints that are around it, it really starts with the interior renewal first, and God providing saints. And so she, again, sort of like we talked about, I think we talked about it last month, about understanding that she knew her place in the church, right? And she knew that her place in the church was as a prayer warrior. And so she was willing to offer her sufferings for, for the church itself. She was willing to, make reparation for the offenses against Christ and the church. And that's something we can all do, right? Like, we don't necessarily always grasp that, right? We're so upset that, this politician did this, this person's blaspheming Jesus, and and we want to do something about it, right? But we should start by making reparation to Christ
through our own prayer, and also making sure that we're praying for our church and for church leaders.
100%. I mean, they are riding on the strength of our prayers, right? And that's what she knew.
And for whatever reason, this is calling to mind a great explanation I heard about the weeds and the wheat. This morning, I just heard it actually on Catholic radio. I think it was Patrick Madrid. He was talking about how we can't just go in and pull out the weeds because we'll take the wheat with it. But he had questioned a farmer about that description, and the farmer said, yeah, it's really interesting because with the weeds that look like wheat, they're so light they can stand straight up, but the wheat is heavier, so it bends down. So it's like a reflection of our humility. And when we're humble, but I thought, oh, that is so good. Yeah. So in humility, not thinking that, we're holier than thou, and praying for the religious, the church leaders. That's the first place to start.
Yeah, and the other thing is, which the weeds and the wheat sort of play this out too, right, is letting God do what God does, and not trying to just bring the end of time right away, right? Because the point of that whole thing is, you wait to harvest time to decide which is which. And very often what we want to do is do it earlier. And that's not what God is asking of us, right? He's asking of us to help, to be witnesses and to be instruments of removing the obstacles in people's way.
Yeah, letting God be the judge, not ourselves. All right, so she emphasized love as the center of holiness. How can we grow in genuine love for God in daily life? What are some tangible examples that you give us, Rob?
So again, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago about understanding that love, like charity, the virtue of charity is a divine gift. And so what we have to do to grow in love is to remove the obstacles so that God can give us more.
Well, give us some examples of the obstacles.
The obstacles are where are the vices in your life? Where are the imperfections? What thought patterns are causing you to speak ill of your neighbor? What I mean, we can just name them. Like, that's our job. Our job is to remove the obstacles, and then God can just keep infusing more and more love. And that's what the saints do. That's what she did, right? Like that emphasis on, I think I go back to Saint Rita, right? She had this vision of Jacob's ladder, and so Christ told her that each of the steps of the ladder was a virtue that she needed to achieve, right? And what he was saying was, remove the obstacles, and you'll climb higher and higher. And so, we think I need to do all these great things for God, and that's beautiful. But very often the problem is we have obstacles in the way because God wants to do great things around us. And it's our obstacles that get in the way, including, the pride that says, I want to do these great things for God, rather than I want to do what God wants me to do. Right.
Spiritual pride.
Yes.
And also, I think it's a great reminder to myself that it's really important to do a daily examine. At the end of the day, it doesn't have to take long. It can only take a couple of minutes. And also frequent confession, because you're constantly calling to mind those vices that you have. Whereas if you're not, it's easy to just kind of forget about them and keep going about your day, and you're not making any...
the most important thing that, like we've probably said, is frequent confession. Like if people just adopt that one habit, your life will change almost pretty much immediately.
Yes, for sure. All right. So she offered hidden sacrifices for others and the church. What role does personal holiness play in transforming the wider church?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's the fact that what do they call it? The odor of sanctity. When they talk about how, I don't think that you really have a smell, but just when someone is holy, you just know it, right? And what it does to us isn't just like, you're like, oh, that's interesting, this person is holy. It elevates you, right? And I mean, saints change the world. And so, when you encounter someone that's holy, you can't help but just be drawn into it. And so, like, let God make you into a saint, and the world will change around you, right? Like, it's not there's no formula for it. It's just become a saint and watch the world change around you.
So what ultimately happened to Saint Mary Magdalene de Pazzi?
Yeah, so she remained in the convent there. They renamed the convent after her. She died there. They kept her remains. I think it's now Our Lady of the Angels of Saint Mary Magdalene de Pazzi, I think is the name of the convent now.
Have you ever been?
No. But her remains are there. I think they're incorrupt. And so there are lots of miracles around her. And so I guess what became of her is she wasn't just Mary Magdalene de Pazzi. She became Saint Mary Magdalene de Pazzi.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And, I think that it's important to remember.
Seems obvious, but,
I think it's important to remember, too, that these saints, and I think it was St. Therese, the Little Flower, said, I'm going to be doing more in heaven than I did when I was on earth. And I feel like this is what we're encountering with these saints that we talk about every month.
Yeah, the beauty of this, right, like that you come to realize is that very often your vocation in the church isn't solidified until you become a part of the communion of saints, right? So you see this. I mean, it seems to be a common theme throughout. All the saints we've studied is it's like what they're really doing is training for their role in the church as members of the communion of saints, right? That's why we have Saint Rita as the patron saint of impossible causes, right? Because her whole life was training so that she could spend heaven doing that for us here on earth.
It's so interesting that my pastor was giving a homily this morning about being pilgrims here on earth, and that, and like our body is a shell to our soul. It's kind of like our earthly existence. It's not really who we ultimately are, and that we're headed to heaven. So, I mean, in that vein, too, that's what we're heading towards, Lord willing, is to be with our brothers and sisters, the saints. So, all right. Any final thoughts on these three amazing saints that we mentioned this month? So. St. Athanasius, St. Rita of Cascia, and St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi. All right. So a quote that's attributed to St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi is, "Come, Holy Spirit, yet let your fire fall upon me, And it sounds like St. Catherine of Siena, doesn't it? All right. And a personal challenge with her is, how can we deepen our prayer life this week and offer it for the renewal of the church? Actually, in that vein, there's going to be a consecration of our country to the Sacred Heart of Jesus that's coming up. And I know that there have been several dioceses that are doing things in anticipation of that. I know that Relevant Radio is doing a novena for that. So I highly recommend that you check that out and consider doing that with your family, reflecting on
is that in
the
June?
Sacred Heart of, yes,
Okay.
yes, in June for the 250th anniversary of our country. So Rob, thank you so much for being with us today. And for helping us unpack the lives of these saints in such a meaningful and relatable way. And if you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on past conversations filled with inspiration and hope, you can find them all at divinemercyradio.org. Just click on local shows. And don't forget, you can take FaithWorks with you wherever you go. Just download the free Divine Mercy Radio app from your app store. Simply search Divine Mercy Radio NC, and you're all set to listen anytime, anywhere. God bless.